they say, Donald Trump's not intimidated by anyone, but he was intimidated by the bond market. We will have a very different sort of multilateral system that perhaps won't be as US dominant as it once was. Now, Donald Trump has to be very careful because you say that he wants lower interest rates. The impact of tariffs are likely to be inflationary. In some ways, he's acting counter to that interest.
Hello and welcome to Live Mint, ladies and gentlemen. I'm joined by Tim Harcourt, who's industry professor and chief economist at the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, Sydney. Tim, hello and welcome to Live Mint. How are you?
Great pleasure to be here.
Now, Tim also hosts the new Airport Economist TV channel on Taker News. Please do check that out. Now, we all know what is happening with Donald Trump and his policies and tariffs over the last 4 months. We have seen how it has played out. Now, since he has been in power, a lot of uncertainties have been prevailing in the market. As an economist, how do you read his mind?
I actually think one mistake economists make is they try and treat Donald Trump like an rational economic actor. Well, he sees it all as power and negotiation. So when he was a property developer, his negotiation tactic was to put something on the table that wasn't there and then negotiate with it off. And so what I think he's trying to do is he's trying to put in all sorts of things, whether they be tariffs or wanting Greenland or something else, and then getting the partner to come to him to negotiate it off one by one. So in a way, he's put himself at the centre of the world trading system instead of the World Trade Organization in Geneva, in the sense that everyone's now coming to him to get the tariffs off, and that's sort of his power game. I don't think it's economically rational, and in some ways, this was started by China. You might remember China put very high tariffs on Australia, 220% on wine and barley and timber and so on. And that was in response to Australia calling for an inquiry into COVID. And perhaps that gave Donald Trump the idea that you can put tariffs.
Sure, Tim. Now, let's talk about the US debt ceiling. You are aware that it has been pushed 78 times since 1990. With Trump and his policies and tariffs, do you think the US can consistently push its debt ceiling time and again? I mean, how many times can this debt burden be put on the rest of the world?
There's two things I don't believe. I mean, there's this modern monetary theory that just says you can spend as much as you want, it doesn't matter. And then the other extreme, there's a fear that any sort of overspend will cause these vigilantes and instability. I think in reality there are long-term constraints, and I think that's why even Donald Trump will adjust his tariff policies in the medium term. But I still think the US's position in the world economy allows it some flexibility. US debt hasn't been an issue just of Donald Trump. I think that's been from successive presidents and Congresses, Republican or Democrat. And as you allude in your question, if the US dollar is the preferred currency of the world, then you can get away with it a lot more in the US than you could in India or Australia or a small open economy because of the US dollar.
The US bond market, ladies and gentlemen, was one of the strongest reasons for Donald Trump to pause his tariffs. Now, bond vigilantes, as they are called, Tim, do you think Trump fears the bond vigilantes in the US, and bond market actually gave a reality check to US and Trump as they gave to Liz Truss and the United Kingdom back in 2022? What do you think?
But I think they say, Donald Trump's not intimidated by anyone, but he was intimidated by the bond market because of the change in yields. So even Donald Trump, with all his seemingly arrogance and confidence, even he had to back down somewhat because of the impacts on the bond market. And look, we know that in some ways this battle is not a battle just over tariffs. It's about the US's place in the global economy and in geopolitics. And that's why, you're seeing a lot of this brinkmanship between China and the US. And I think what Donald Trump's doing with Europe and Canada and the Ukraine and Iran is partly to clear the decks, to have, in some ways, a contest with China, or at least try to contain some of the aggression of China on the global economy.
Sure. Now, let's talk about de-dollarization a bit, Tim. With China and other countries, trying to push their individual currencies for trade. And there have been conversations about de-dollarizations for the past few years, especially post-COVID, and now since US debt is at an all-time high and the way Donald Trump has been behaving. How strong do you think is the case for de-dollarization or any other currency which wants to take over dollar as an international currency?
Yeah, look, it reminds me of the old story about Winston Churchill when they asked him about democracy, and he said democracy is a terrible system, but it's better than the alternatives. And I think the same way with the dollar. I think, yeah, there are some pressures, but I can't see an alternative rising in that sense. I do know that people will hold multiple currencies. I mean, exporters do as a matter of course. But at the moment, despite some wishful thinking, I think, by some antagonists of the US, I don't think there will be dollarization. Having said that, there's clearly been a change in the World Trade Order. I mean, even the rise of APEC was started to avoid currency blocks around the then Deutschmark before the euro, the dollar and the yen. So I think trade structures will recalibrate, if you like, and we will have a very different sort of multilateral system that perhaps won't be as US dominant as it once was. But I can't see an alternative currency taking its place, although I do think there'll be some alternative ways of governing the global economy, and that's probably overdue in a sense.
Okay, now let me ask this question to you as an economics student, Tim. For people who love history, let me present a little bit of history for all our audience. Till 1971, dollar was linked with gold. In 1971, Richard Nixon de-linked dollar with gold. So before 1971, the amount of dollar you had in your reserve, you could exchange that for gold. But in 1971, Richard Nixon de-linked dollar with gold, and US dollar became the international currency by default. My question to you, Tim, is that how long can this continue? Till how long can US keep printing currency, keep devaluing their currency?
We've just had the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, and you'll remember that the US had to basically print a lot of money to finance the war in Vietnam, and as a result, we had stagflation around the world in the 70s that hung around with adverse consequences. So I do think there's a limit. I do think that ultimately the MMT people will say you can run as much debt as you can, but in actual fact there are inflationary consequences, and potentially you could have inflation and unemployment like we did in the 1970s. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend it from the lessons of economic history.
Sure. Now, let me ask you, Tim, US needs more money than ever before. We all remember cheap money, which has always been the case with US 0% interest rate, especially post-COVID, when Federal Reserve said that this inflation is transitory and the interest rates were the lowest. Loan seeking probably was the easiest job in the US. Now, high inflation post-COVID was much of a Fed Reserve and Jerome Powell doing. But where do you see this equation going now? With Jerome Powell, whose core mandate is inflation, and Trump, on the other hand, who wants 0% interest rate. There is a friction amongst the two, which has been visible for the last few days. Where do you see this equation going?
Well, Jerome Powell is doing his job. He's got an inflation mandate, just like a central banker like Michelle Bullock does in Australia, or the governor of the central bank in India is the same. So in many ways, that's their job. But they did get on the wrong side of the cycle post-COVID after all that spending in the economy. So I think they are a little bit trigger shy to some extent. So they'll be very careful about lowering rates. But for the most part, it seems some of the inflationary pressures that we saw after COVID have come out of the system. Now, Donald Trump has to be very careful because you say that he wants lower interest rates and cheaper credit. But of course, the impact of tariffs are likely to be inflationary because they drive up the price of imports. So in some ways, he's acting counter to that interest. And Jerome Powell has to act on inflation, whether it be from tariffs or outlandish fiscal spending that we saw during COVID. So it doesn't matter what the source is. He has to look at the impacts of inflation. That's his job.